The alien princess taunted a young human teen. He chose silence on a distant world, far from the familiar blue of Earth. A young human named Adam stood in awe. He was part of the human delegation, chosen to represent Earth at an intergalactic summit. The summit was held on Athrana, a planet known for its sprawling jungles and towering cities that reached into the clouds. It was a place where different alien species gathered to discuss matters of peace, trade, and the future of their shared galaxy. Adam was one of the few humans invited to this prestigious event, and his presence was a mix of honor and nervousness. The gathering was held in a massive dome, with holographic displays and transparent walls that gave a clear view of the lush greenery outside. In the center of the room, representatives from various alien civilizations mingled. Some were towering and muscular, while others had smooth, metallic skin, and still others were nearly invisible, their forms shifting like shadows. But amid all the diversity of life, there was one figure who stood out, drawing the eyes of everyone in the room: Princess Lyra. She was a member of the Zeltrith Empire, one of the most powerful factions in the galaxy. Lyra was unlike anyone Adam had ever seen before. Tall, with striking features and long, silvery hair that cascaded like a waterfall, she carried herself with the kind of confidence that only royalty could possess. Her skin shimmered faintly under the room's lights, a soft lavender hue, while her eyes glowed with an almost unnatural intensity, a color that seemed to shift between violet and blue. As the summit began, Adam took his place among the other delegates. He had only read about the Zeltrith Empire and its noble rulers in history books, but nothing could have prepared him for the presence of Princess Lyra in person. She commanded attention effortlessly, every step calculated, every word spoken with grace and authority. Yet there was something about her that made Adam uneasy. It wasn't her beauty or her power. It was the way she seemed to look at humans, as though they were nothing more than insects beneath her feet. The moment came when Adam found himself in the same circle as Lyra. The atmosphere around them shifted as she turned her attention to him, her gaze piercing through him like she could see right into his thoughts. It was a look that made him feel small, insignificant. As the conversation continued, Lyra casually began to speak, her voice smooth and elegant, yet her words sharp, like a dagger wrapped in velvet. "You must be the human, Adam," she said, her tone sweet but dripping with an undercurrent of mockery. "I've heard so much about your kind. Weak, fragile creatures, always scrambling for survival in a universe that doesn't care." The room seemed to quiet for a moment, the other delegates watching, some with mild curiosity, others with amusement. Lyra's words were not meant as a question, but rather a statement, one that held a judgment many found unsettling. Adam remained silent, his eyes lowered, not daring to meet her gaze. It wasn't fear that kept him quiet, but rather the sense that responding would only feed into the trap she had set. He knew the power of silence, the way it could defy those who expected a reaction. It was the same silence that had allowed him to survive years of bullying and challenges back on Earth. It was his shield, and he wielded it now more than ever. Lyra raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting a response. The corner of her mouth curled into a smirk as she leaned forward slightly. "Oh, are humans too afraid to speak?" she continued, her voice like a silken whip. "Or perhaps you're just not intelligent enough to respond." Still, Adam said nothing. The silence between them grew thick, like an invisible wall that neither side was willing to break. The tension was palpable, and for a moment, Lyra seemed to falter. It wasn't just that Adam remained silent, but the fact that his silence was so deliberate, so powerful, that it made her feel unsure. She had never encountered a human who didn't react to her taunts, who didn't feel the need to defend themselves or seek validation. But Adam was different. The princess glanced around, expecting support or laughter from the other delegates, but instead the room remained hushed. Adam's calmness was both unsettling and fascinating. Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something new in them, curiosity. She quickly masked it, though, returning to her regal composure. After a long pause, she turned away, clearly uninterested in prolonging her engagement with someone she deemed beneath her. But even as she walked away, her gaze lingered on Adam for just a second longer than necessary. It was a fleeting moment, but it spoke volumes. Lyra wasn't used to being ignored, not in such a direct, calculated way. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Adam. He found himself lost in thoughts about the encounter. He hadn't planned for it to happen this way. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He simply didn't feel the need to play her game. And yet that silence, that simple act of choosing not to react, had left an impression far greater than any words he could have spoken. As the event came to an end, Adam stood by the door, watching the guests leave. His mind was still reeling from the tension of the encounter. For a moment he wondered if he had made a mistake by staying silent, but deep down he knew it was the right choice. Words could be twisted, manipulated, used against him. Silence, on the other hand, was his. It was the one thing no one could take from him. The next day the delegates gathered again, and to Adam's surprise, Lyra sought him out. It wasn't in a confrontational manner, nor was it an apology. It was simply a strange, unspoken invitation. She didn't approach him with words of mockery or disdain, but instead with an unreadable expression that hinted at something deeper. She studied him as if trying to decipher the puzzle that was Adam, a human who didn't fit the mold she had built in her mind. "Human," she said, her voice now softer, tinged with curiosity. "You are unlike any I've encountered before. There's something about your silence. It intrigues me." Adam looked up at her, his expression still calm, his eyes steady. For the first time, he met her gaze fully, his silence speaking volumes. "Perhaps one day," he said quietly, his voice strong despite the calmness in it, "you will understand." With that, Lyra turned and walked away, but this time, Adam sensed that the encounter was far from over. Something had shifted between them, something unspoken, and though he didn't know where it would lead, he had no doubt that the silence he had chosen was more powerful than any words could have been. And so the encounter ended, but the tension between the alien princess and the young human teen only deepened, setting the stage for a journey neither of them could have predicted. The next few days at the summit were filled with intense discussions, debates, and diplomatic meetings. Adam found himself surrounded by alien representatives, each with their own cultures, ideals, and ways of thinking. Yet despite the busy atmosphere, his mind kept drifting back to Princess Lyra. Her presence seemed to loom over him even when she wasn't nearby. He had never expected that his silence would have such an impact on her, and the thought of her curiosity stirred something inside him. He had never been one to seek attention, but the way she had looked at him that night, so intently, so intrigued, was something he couldn't shake. It was on the third day that Lyra approached him again, though this time, it wasn't during one of the summit's official sessions. The delegates were given free time to relax and mingle in a garden that stretched across the edge of the city. Adam stood near the fountain, his hands resting lightly on the stone edge, gazing at the clear water as it rippled with every small breeze. He was lost in thought when he heard the soft rustle of footsteps behind him. "Human," came her voice, cool and steady as ever. Adam turned slowly, recognizing her presence even before she spoke. He didn't show any sign of surprise, only maintaining his calm demeanor. Lyra stood a few feet away, her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied him. Her expression wasn't mocking this time, but instead one of genuine curiosity. "You've been quiet ever since we spoke last," Lyra said, her tone still sharp, but without the usual taunt. "I've been thinking about our conversation." "Your silence, it's unlike anything I've ever encountered." Adam didn't respond immediately. He didn't feel the need to. There was nothing to say, and his silence was enough to communicate his thoughts. Lyra's eyes flickered with impatience as she took a step closer, her gaze never leaving him. "Don't you ever wonder why you remain silent?" she asked, her voice carrying an edge of frustration, though she seemed almost intrigued by his lack of reaction. "Most humans would have tried to defend themselves by now. You, on the other hand, choose to say nothing at all. Why? Are you so afraid of me, or is there something else? Some hidden reason for your silence?" Adam looked at her then, his eyes meeting hers with a calmness that only seemed to deepen her curiosity. He had heard the question before, many times from people back on Earth who didn't understand him. It wasn't about fear, and it wasn't about weakness. It was simply about choosing when and how to speak. After a long pause, Adam spoke softly, his words measured. "Silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it's the strongest thing a person can do." Lyra tilted her head slightly, clearly taken aback by his response. She hadn't expected him to speak at all, let alone offer such a profound answer. For a moment she seemed to consider his words, her sharp features softening ever so slightly. "Interesting," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Perhaps you're not like the others after all." Adam didn't offer any more words. Instead, he turned back to the fountain, his gaze once again focused on the water. Lyra stood there for a moment, watching him. It was clear that she hadn't gotten the response she wanted. She was used to people being intimidated by her, to having them cower under her influence. But Adam was different, and that difference fascinated her more than she wanted to admit. Over the next few days, Lyra continued to seek out Adam during moments of downtime. She would find him reading alone or standing in quiet contemplation, and each time she tried to provoke him. Sometimes, she would test him with sharp comments about the weakness of humans, other times with challenges of intellect or strategy. But each time Adam remained the same, silent, composed, and calm. It became a game for her, though she didn't fully realize it. Every encounter was a new test to break him, to make him react. Yet the more she tried, the more she failed. Adam's silence remained impenetrable, a wall that neither her words nor her actions could break down. One evening, Lyra found him standing by a balcony, gazing out over the vast city below. The lights of Athrana flickered like stars, casting a soft glow across the landscape. She approached him, her footsteps light but purposeful. She could feel the familiar rush of frustration building inside her, the need to make him speak, to make him show emotion. "This silence," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "It's starting to become maddening. Why do you refuse to speak? Don't you want to prove me wrong? Don't you want to show me that humans can be powerful in ways that go beyond their silence?" Adam turned his head slightly, glancing at her out of the corner of his eye. His gaze was steady, his expression still calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Lyra couldn't place it, but it was there. Perhaps it was understanding, perhaps it was something more. "I don't need to prove anything," he replied quietly. "I know who I am. I don't need your approval." Lyra's lips parted, the words hanging in the air for a moment. She wasn't used to hearing that from anyone, let alone from a human. There was no anger in his voice, no defensiveness, just a quiet certainty that unnerved her. For the first time, Lyra didn't know how to respond. Her typical charm, her power, her ability to control a conversation, none of it worked on Adam. She found herself standing there, unsure of what to say or do. Her usual tactics of provoking others had failed, and the silence between them grew longer, heavier. "Why do you resist?" Lyra asked, the question not just about his silence, but about the essence of who he was. "Why not fight back? Why not challenge me?" Adam looked at her then, truly meeting her eyes for the first time in what felt like ages. His gaze was not confrontational, nor was it filled with any emotion that could be easily read. It was simply steady. "I'm not interested in fighting for the sake of fighting," he said, his voice calm as always. "Words are like weapons, and I choose not to use them unless I have to." Lyra stood there, the weight of his words settling over her. She had always relied on her sharp tongue, her beauty, her intelligence to bend people to her will. But Adam wasn't like everyone else. He didn't react the way she expected, and in doing so, he had unknowingly forced her to rethink everything she thought she knew about human beings. As the silence stretched between them, Lyra found herself standing in an unfamiliar position. She was the one left speechless. She had always prided herself on being able to control any situation, but Adam's quiet defiance had upended that. For the first time, she wasn't sure where to go from here. "I don't understand you," she finally said, her voice tinged with something softer, almost curious. "You don't act like any human I've ever met." Adam turned away from the balcony, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Maybe that's because I'm not trying to be like anyone you've met." There was nothing more to say after that. Lyra watched him as he walked away, a strange feeling settling in her chest. She didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of something she hadn't expected. The more she tried to understand Adam, the more intrigued she became. It wasn't just his silence that fascinated her. It was the way he made her question everything she thought she knew about strength, power, and control. And for once, she didn't have the answers. As the days passed, Lyra's fascination with Adam only grew. She continued to observe him, each interaction more perplexing than the last. But Adam, for his part, remained unchanged. His silence wasn't a wall, it was his way of existing, his way of asserting that he didn't need to prove himself to anyone. And in that quiet confidence, he had unwittingly challenged the very foundation of everything Lyra had once believed. The days passed, and with each passing moment, the tension between Adam and Lyra continued to grow. The summit was coming to an end, and the delegates were beginning to prepare for their departure. Yet, Adam found himself increasingly intrigued by the alien princess. Her presence was like a storm, beautiful and destructive, yet impossible to ignore. It was clear that she hadn't expected him to remain so calm, so composed in the face of everything she had thrown at him, and that fascinated her. During the last few days of the summit, there were fewer formal discussions and more social gatherings. These were meant to allow the delegates to interact freely, to form personal connections outside of the rigid rules of diplomacy. Adam, however, didn't feel the need to engage in the typical small talk. He preferred quiet moments alone, or with a few select people who could carry a conversation without the need for games or false pleasantries. But it was during one of these gatherings, in a lavishly decorated hall filled with elegant alien diplomats and their entourages, that Adam saw a side of Lyra he had not expected. She was no longer the icy princess with sharp words and distant eyes. Instead, she seemed almost vulnerable. It was subtle, but it was there, a shift in her posture, the way her hands fidgeted with the edge of her cloak, the way her eyes no longer held that smug superiority. For the first time, Adam saw that there was more to her than the calculated, cold facade she wore in public. As the crowd mingled, Lyra's gaze drifted to him as it often did. This time, though, there was no taunt, no challenge, just silence. It was strange how different she looked without the sharpness in her expression. Adam couldn't help but notice, but he said nothing. The silence between them had become a familiar thing, a constant in their interactions. He wasn't sure if it was out of stubbornness or something deeper, but he didn't feel the need to break it. Lyra walked toward him, her footsteps soft against the polished stone floor. Adam's gaze shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge her approach, but he didn't say anything. She stood beside him, staring out at the gardens beyond the grand windows of the hall. For a long while, neither of them spoke. "I've been thinking," Lyra finally said, her voice quieter than usual, almost tentative. "You know, about you and your silence." Adam didn't respond, but his eyes flickered toward her, waiting for her to continue. You don't respond to anything, do you?" she asked, her tone curious, as if trying to unravel a mystery. "Not to insults, not to praise, not to anything. Why is that?" Adam turned to face her fully, and for the first time there was no trace of mockery in her voice. "Just genuine interest. I don't need to respond to everything," Adam said simply. "Not every word is worth reacting to. Some things are better left unspoken." Lyra looked at him then, her violet eyes searching his face. "And what about me? Have you been ignoring me on purpose?" Adam met her gaze, and for a moment there was no tension between them, just two individuals standing in a quiet space, letting the world go on around them. "I haven't been ignoring you," Adam replied. "I've just been waiting. Waiting to see if you would want to have a real conversation." Lyra's brow furrowed slightly, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to being so directly addressed, so plainly spoken to. She was used to control, to manipulation, to bending others to her will with a few well-chosen words. But Adam didn't care about any of that. He was content in his silence, and in that silence he had more control than she ever could. The moment stretched, and the air between them seemed to hum with something unspoken, a new understanding beginning to form. "You really are different," Lyra said quietly, almost as if to herself. "I've never met anyone like you." Adam didn't speak. There was no need to. His silence had already said enough. Over the following days, the political tensions surrounding the summit began to intensify. Several factions, both human and alien, had disagreements that threatened to derail the fragile peace talks. Lyra found herself more and more caught up in the conflict, her position as a princess and a diplomat pushing her into the thick of the negotiations. But despite the increasing pressure, her mind kept drifting back to Adam. There was something about him, something that kept pulling at her. His silence wasn't a weakness. It was his strength, his way of remaining calm and focused in a world that demanded constant noise and reaction. She had always relied on words, on the sharpness of her intellect to control situations. But Adam didn't need words. He was calm in a way that Lyra couldn't understand, and it unsettled her. It was during one of the most heated meetings at the summit that Lyra found herself in a position where she had to make a choice. The room was filled with representatives from various factions, each arguing their case with increasing intensity. The atmosphere was charged with hostility, and it seemed like the peace talks would fall apart at any moment. As the debate grew louder, Lyra's gaze flicked to Adam, who was sitting quietly in the corner, his expression calm, unaffected by the chaos around him. She couldn't help but wonder how he could remain so composed in such a tense situation. How could he be so unaffected? As the argument reached its peak, Lyra stood up, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Enough," she commanded, her voice firm and strong, though her eyes still flickered to Adam. She felt a strange sense of confidence when she looked at him, as if his calm had given her the strength to speak. "We are here to find a solution, not to argue. I suggest we all take a step back and reconsider our positions." Her words resonated with the room, and for the first time in hours, the delegates fell silent. Adam's gaze met hers across the room, and for a brief moment, Lyra saw something in his eyes, a quiet approval. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged her without a word, and it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. After the meeting, as the delegates filed out, Lyra approached Adam once again. This time there was no game, no taunting. Just a simple truth hanging in the air between them. "You were right," she said quietly. "Silence, it has power, I see that now." Adam looked at her, his expression unreadable as always. But this time, Lyra saw something in his eyes that she hadn't before, a hint of something more, something deeper. It wasn't just his silence that intrigued her now. It was the way he moved through the world, the way he remained calm in the face of everything that tried to pull him into chaos. "You've always had the power," Adam said quietly. "You just needed to realize it." Lyra didn't speak, but she smiled faintly. For the first time, she truly understood. In a world of noise, of conflict, of power struggles, Adam had shown her that sometimes the greatest strength lay in choosing not to speak, in choosing to wait, to watch, and to let things unfold on their own terms. And in that quiet, unspoken moment, Lyra realized that perhaps she was beginning to understand the human she had once mocked. And perhaps, just perhaps, she had a lot more to learn from him than she had ever imagined. The summit was nearing its end, and the days had become a blur of meetings, discussions, and uneasy silences. Lyra, the proud princess of the Zeltrith Empire, found herself caught in a whirlwind of diplomatic maneuvering, each faction pulling in different directions, each delegate trying to further their own interests. The tensions were high, and the weight of the galaxy's peace rested on her shoulders. Yet, despite all the politics, despite the swirling conflict around her, there was one thing she couldn't shake: Adam. He had become a constant presence in her thoughts. Not because of his words, he rarely spoke, but because of the way he carried himself, the way he remained calm in the most chaotic situations. He had shown her something she hadn't expected, strength in stillness, and it was a kind of strength she couldn't easily define. That night, after another grueling meeting where no resolutions had been made, Lyra found herself standing alone in a quiet corner of the summit hall, looking out at the stars through the transparent walls. The distant lights of Othrana shimmered below, but the beauty of the scene did little to ease her mind. Peace was slipping through their fingers, and her empire, her people, were depending on her to keep the negotiations alive. As she stood there, lost in thought, she felt a presence behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. His calm energy always seemed to find its way to her. "Adam," she said softly, not needing to ask him what he was doing here. She had grown accustomed to his quiet presence. He didn't answer immediately, but his shadow fell across the floor beside her. It was a rare moment for both of them. No words, no expectations, just the space between them filled with something unspoken. "You've been avoiding the summit," Lyra said, her tone casual, though there was an edge of concern in her voice. "Not attending the meetings, not engaging with the others. Why?" Adam's silence, as usual, was his answer. He didn't say anything, didn't try to defend his actions or explain his choices. But Lyra could see it in his eyes. It wasn't about avoiding responsibility. It was about a choice to step away from the noise and the chaos to maintain clarity. He had always seemed to see things from a different perspective, unaffected by the usual pressures that weighed so heavily on the others. "I don't need to be a part of everything to understand what's going on," Adam said quietly, his voice steady but low. "Sometimes it's better to observe than to act, to let the chaos settle on its own." Lyra turned to face him fully now, studying him with a mixture of frustration and awe. "You make it sound so simple, just wait and let it happen. How can you stand by and do nothing when everything is falling apart?" Adam met her gaze, his eyes calm, and for the first time she saw a flicker of understanding in them. "Because sometimes doing nothing is the most powerful thing you can do. You don't have to fix everything." Sometimes the right solution is simply to wait for the right moment. Lyra exhaled slowly, as if trying to process his words. They seemed too simplistic, too passive for someone like her. She had been trained to act, to make decisions quickly, to use her power and intellect to shape the outcome. She had never been one to wait. But Adam's stillness, his quiet confidence, made her wonder if she had been going about things all wrong. Maybe it wasn't about rushing to solve every problem. Maybe it was about trusting in the process, trusting that things would unfold as they were meant to. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, and Lyra glanced over her shoulder. A few of the delegates had returned from their late-night discussions, their voices rising in heated argument as they passed by. But despite the noise, Lyra remained where she stood, beside Adam, in a quiet space that felt removed from the chaos. She felt something shift inside her, an unfamiliar sense of peace. For the next few days, Lyra found herself thinking more and more about Adam's words. She had always been driven by a need to prove herself, to push for results, to control the outcome. She had been trained for this her entire life, groomed to be a leader of her people. But Adam's approach, his calm detachment, had opened her eyes to something she had never considered before, the power of patience. As the summit drew to a close, the discussions grew more heated. Factions who had once seemed willing to compromise were now at odds, and Lyra felt the weight of her responsibilities pressing down harder than ever. She tried to mediate, to use her influence to keep the talks from falling apart, but nothing seemed to work. The divide between the factions grew wider, and she realized that the peace they had fought for was slipping further out of reach. It was in the midst of this crisis that Lyra sought out Adam once more. The pressure was mounting, and she knew she couldn't handle it alone. She needed his calm, his perspective. Despite her pride, despite her desire to solve everything herself, she couldn't deny that Adam had something she lacked: clarity. She found him in a secluded garden, the same one where they had spoken before. He was sitting on a stone bench, his hands folded calmly in his lap. He didn't look up as she approached, but somehow she knew he was aware of her presence. "Adam," Lyra said, her voice soft but firm, "I need your help." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a quiet understanding. "What's wrong?" "I can't fix this," Lyra admitted, the weight of her words sinking in as she spoke them. "I can't make them agree. The factions are too divided. I've tried everything, but nothing seems to work. I don't know what to do anymore." Adam didn't respond right away. He simply watched her, his gaze steady and patient. Then slowly he spoke. "Sometimes you don't need to fix everything. Sometimes you need to let go." Lyra stared at him, taken aback by the simplicity of his words. "Let go," she repeated, "but if I let go, everything will fall apart." Adam shook his head. "You're not letting go of your responsibility. You're letting go of the need to control everything. You can't force them to agree. You can only guide them to the point where they can make their own decisions." Lyra felt a knot in her chest loosen as she listened to him. His words were like a balm to the burn of frustration she had been carrying for so long. She had been so focused on controlling the outcome, on pushing others to fall in line with her vision, that she had forgotten what true leadership was about. It wasn't about control. It was about trust, trust in others and trust in the process. "What if they refuse to listen?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "Then you wait," Adam said simply. "You wait for them to realize the importance of what's at stake. You trust that they will see reason in their own time." For a long moment, Lyra stood there, processing his words. She had never considered that approach before, never thought that sometimes the best thing to do was simply to wait and trust. But now, as she stood in the quiet garden with Adam, she felt something inside her shift. Maybe this was the answer she had been looking for all along. The next day, Lyra made the difficult decision to step back. She would no longer push the factions to agree. Instead, she would let them come to their own conclusions, trusting that they would recognize the importance of peace. It wasn't easy for her, but as the hours passed and the delegates continued their debates, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had done all she could. Now it was up to them. By the end of the day, something remarkable happened. Slowly, the factions began to come together. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't perfect, but the walls that had separated them started to crack. The peace talks, once on the brink of collapse, began to gain momentum again. Lyra watched it unfold, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and awe. She had done it, not by forcing her will on others, but by letting go and trusting in the process. And as she looked across the room, she caught Adam's gaze. He nodded at her, a small, approving smile on his face. For the first time, Lyra realized that he had been right all along. The power of silence, of patience, of letting things unfold naturally. This was a strength she could learn to wield. In that moment, Lyra knew that this summit would end in peace. Not because of her, but because she had finally learned the art of waiting, of trusting others to do their part. And in that trust, she found the greatest strength of all. As the summit neared its final day, a calm, unexpected quiet had descended upon the delegates. Lyra stood by the large windows overlooking the bustling city of Athrana, watching the vibrant lights flicker in the distance. It had been a tense few weeks, filled with arguments, accusations, and the threat of peace slipping away. Yet in this moment, as she stood silently in the gathering dusk, something had changed. It wasn't the peace agreement she had hoped for, it was something more subtle. She had come to understand the value of stillness and trust, the lessons that Adam had unknowingly shown her. The last few days had unfolded in ways Lyra couldn't have predicted. Once she had let go of the need to control everything, once she had allowed the delegates to come to their own conclusions, things started to shift. The factions that had once been so divided began to find common ground. The human side, represented by Adam, had remained silent throughout most of the process, but his quiet strength had influenced the room more than any speech ever could. The Zeltrith and human factions had begun to cooperate, recognizing the importance of the peace that was at stake. Adam's silence had, in its own way, become the catalyst for change. It was strange, Lyra thought. She had come to the summit expecting to use her influence to guide others, to shape the future with her own hands. But now, she realized that leadership wasn't about controlling every outcome. It was about understanding when to step back, when to let others take the lead, and when to trust in the process. The wisdom she had gained from Adam's unwavering patience had opened her eyes to this truth. Now, as the summit drew to a close, Lyra found herself standing at a crossroads. The peace agreement was almost finalized, and the tensions had finally eased. Yet there was still something left unfinished between her and Adam. They had shared countless moments of silence, and in that silence, something had blossomed between them. But what exactly was it? Her thoughts were interrupted as Adam walked into the room. As always, he moved with the same quiet composure, his presence almost invisible, yet undeniable. There was a sense of calm about him that she had come to admire, even as it continued to puzzle her. He wasn't a man of grand gestures or fiery speeches. He simply existed with a stillness that spoke volumes. "Adam," she said, her voice soft, "I wanted to thank you." He looked at her, his expression neutral as ever. "For what?" "For showing me a different way," Lyra replied, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had learned. "For teaching me that silence isn't weakness, it's strength." Adam nodded, a flicker of something, perhaps approval, shining in his eyes. "You learned it on your own," he said. "I only pointed out the path, you walked it." Lyra paused, feeling something shift inside her. She had spent her entire life fighting to prove herself, to prove that she was more than her title, more than her heritage. She had fought to earn respect, to demand it from others. But Adam had shown her that there was a quieter, more powerful way to command respect. It wasn't in words, it wasn't in actions. It was in being true to oneself, in remaining calm amidst chaos, and in trusting that the universe would unfold as it was meant to. "I never understood you," Lyra confessed, her voice almost a whisper. "But now I think I do." Adam remained silent, but there was something in his eyes that told her he understood exactly what she meant. There were no grand declarations between them, no promises, just a quiet understanding, one that needed no words to define it. The room fell into silence once more, and Lyra stood there, feeling an odd sense of peace settle over her. She had learned more from Adam than she could have imagined, and though their paths were different, she knew that they had crossed for a reason. Her people were at peace now, and the summit had been a success, but this journey, the one she had taken with Adam, was one she would never forget. He had changed her in ways she hadn't fully realized at the time, and she could feel that change in the very core of her being. As they stood together in the quiet room, Lyra felt a strange sense of gratitude. For all the grand events of the summit, for all the debates and heated discussions, it was the silent moments that had taught her the most. It was in the pauses, in the stillness between words, that she had discovered a new path forward. And Adam, with his quiet strength, had been the one to show her the way. The moment stretched on, and Lyra finally spoke again, her voice steady but filled with emotion. You've taught me more than I could ever thank you for. I've learned that true strength comes not from what you can force, but from what you can choose to let go of. I couldn't have done this without you." Adam's eyes met hers, and for the first time there was a warmth in his gaze. "You didn't need me to do it. You just needed to realize that you had the strength all along." Lyra's lips curled into a small smile. There were no more words to say, no more explanations needed. In that moment, she knew that their journey was over, but their connection would remain, woven into the fabric of the decisions they had made together. The summit ended with a final toast, the delegates raising their glasses to the future of peace between the galaxies. But for Lyra and Adam, the real victory had already been won. They had forged a bond without words, a bond that spoke louder than any agreement ever could. It wasn't about victory. It was about understanding. It was about realizing that silence, patience, and trust were the true keys to leadership. As the delegates departed, Lyra stood at the center of the room, alone for the first time in weeks. The weight of her responsibilities had not disappeared, but it no longer felt as heavy. The lessons Adam had taught her had lightened her heart, allowing her to approach the future with a newfound sense of peace. She no longer needed to prove herself. She had already done that quietly through her actions. In the quiet of the moment, Lyra realized that she had found something more important than power or influence. She had found a deeper connection to herself, and to the silent strength that could change the course of history.